Hi, hello, and welcome to Poppedia Podcast. I'm Kunal with Yash and Aarav. This is the monthly guest episode of the podcast. This month, we are joined by the wonderful Ekwa, and we are going to discuss the subtle and not so subtle philosophical themes and symbols in Ekwa's film, Farewell Amor. Ekwa Msangi is a Tanzanian American filmmaker, producer, and screenwriter. She also teaches production and cultural studies at New York University. Hi, Ekwa, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, we are great. Just starting the podcast, I wanted to ask you ki, your film tries to follow lives of these broken characters, right? One thing that I wanted to ask is, what is your perception of the American dream?
That's a great question. I think the American dream is very different for different people. And there's the dream and there's the reality, right? There's what is advertised as the experience and what the actual experience on the ground is. So if you're asking me what my experience has been, that's very different than what the dream of my experience was supposed to be. And also keeping in mind that I am an immigrant in the sense that I grew up outside of the US. I grew up in East Africa, which is where my family's from, but I was the only child in my family born in the US. So I haven't had legally the immigrant experience, which is a huge difference from what most people who come to the US as people of color and certainly as artists go through. But it's in short, I would say it is an experience of smoke and mirrors.
Nice.
What is advertised is not necessarily what happens.
And has that helped you make the film what it is? Your experience of, or your perception of American Dream and your experience of American Dream, does that make Farewell Amor what we see on screen today?
Yes, it definitely has made a huge contribution to my perspective of that story, given my own experiences coming back to the US as a 17-year-old and experiencing the cultural differences and the pressure to assimilate, as my character Sylvia did. And also just living in immigrant communities. As I've lived in New York for over 25 years, I've always lived in some sort of immigrant community, which is where I feel comfortable. And, you get to know people and befriend people and hear their stories. And I mean, just taking a taxi anywhere in New York, you'll hear all the stories about the family that's at home, the children who are at home, I'm going home, I'm coming back, all the different iterations of how life works for people of color who are not originally from or don't have several generations from the US.
Help people escape the problems, and how does it affect the people around them? And is there any event in your life which you've experienced of certain kind?
The answer to your question is, does religion help people escape their problems? I think it does, or I think they think it does, which is the most important thing. What I think doesn't really matter.
Are you religious?
I'm not religious, no.
Okay.
I am spiritual, but I'm not I would not describe myself as a religious person, but I grew up in very religious environments. And so I've been exposed to and have a lot of relatives who are very zealous about their particularly Christian practice. I have relatives who are Muslim as well, but of my Christian relatives, there's Christianity and then there's Christianity. Not everybody practices the same. And I think specifically for women, it falls a little bit differently for women who are married, because of how much people tend to answer the question to every problem with just pray about it. Jesus will help you.
Yes.
If it's not working, then you're not praying hard enough. Or maybe you need to give money to the church, or maybe you need to spend the night praying in church, or maybe you need to give some sort of sacrifice. And, I mean, the same kind of thing shows up in a lot of different religious practices. So it's not really fair to say that it's just Christianity. That's just what I've seen and experienced. But I know that there's aspects of that in a lot of different other kinds of religious practices as well, is, the devotion, and how devoted you are then equals having, better luck in your relationships, in your love life, in your family, in your children, not, becoming failures or whatever.
Yeah. And after that, I want to ask like a sort of question for the people who are just like getting into filmmaking. So that question would be that what were some hiccups that you faced in the making of Farewell Amor, which you didn't know that you would face, which you didn't calculate through, or that you just didn't process and you just faced it. When you faced it and you just went through it.
Well, I will say, I don't know about not calculating, because my producing partner and I'd like to say we're very careful about calculating and making sure that, and, and knowing how much we didn't know. And therefore, surrounding ourselves with people who had more experience in the aspects that we didn't have experience, so that they could help us. They could help walk us through. So there was a lot of newness in this. Was certainly the biggest project that either of us had done. Big in terms of the budget that we were working with, and the kinds of investors that, it wasn't just one person, the director or the producer, who had kind of cobbled together some money and some sandwiches and, some duct tape, and we're making it happen. But we had actually formal investors with, legal contracts and a law team and this, and there's a lot of responsibility.
Yes.
And therefore, so that was new in terms of managing the responsibilities. You can't just be like, you know what, I don't like the story anymore. I'm just gonna let it, we'll just see what happens. You're gonna have to finish it because somebody's expecting their money back.
Yes.
And then, also because we have investors, that changes the way that you make the film. I'm used to raising $500, $600, $1,000 and making a small little film with my friends. And then I make all the decisions, and then I'm like, here's my film, I finished, enjoy it.
Yeah.
But in this case, if somebody's giving you $500,000, $250,000 for your film, then they have an opinion about all the different steps too, which I didn't know. I didn't know to expect that. So it was a surprise when all of a sudden, I was sort of like, okay, this is who I like, and this is what we're doing. And they're like, oh, we don't really like it, or we have thoughts, or, or they want to talk about it. And I just wasn't prepared. I didn't know that I needed to talk to anybody about it. And that also included the editing process, where I'm used to just me and the editor decide what we think is best, and I show it to a few friends and we call it a day. And this was where the investors also wanted to see it, and then they wanted to give us notes, and it was notes that, I mean, at the end of the day, I was able to make the director's cut and make my decision as to what I wanted, but I did still have to, at the very least, listen and consider what they had to say. And we had test screenings, and so we had to consider what those people had to say. And so it was a much bigger collaboration than I had experienced before, with much bigger consequences, basically. I mean, in both good and bad ways, not just in terms of like, if people didn't get their money back, but also in terms of when things go well. Now we're talking about like, are we going to apply for the Oscars? Are we going to do, we've never done that before. So that's an exciting part of it, but also new.
You know
Yeah.
what, Ekwa, I really want to congratulate you for this film, right? Because right
you.
now we are making a film. It's very low budget. We are making on phone. It's experimental
Great.
cinema.
Well,
so,
fantastic.
but people don't realize how hard it is to make films.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right now I'm directing a film. It's a very fun process, but I constantly have to go back to footage, to sound and all this stuff. So I cannot
Mhm.
imagine what it might have been for you in that case when you're making a movie this big. So
Yeah.
Mhm.
I really want to congratulate you, because it's such a big and great thing to make a film on this level. I cannot even imagine handling all this, because right now what we are doing is very tough. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Like a lot of times now that we watch movies, we appreciate it like, oh, this shit
Ha.
would be very hard to edit or very hard to
Yeah.
take as a footage. We go on like that. We ramble about like scenes. So
Yeah.
that's what
Yeah.
changes when you
So
starting.
like my personal perception towards films has changed after I started making my movie. So like, has
Hmm.
that happened with you?
My appreciation for for the
Ha.
process
Yeah.
of
Hmm.
making films. Yes.
Mhm.
But I will say in this, I've made a lot of low budget, no budget on my phone
Experimental.
equivalent. Yeah,
Hmm.
experimental films for a long time. I mean,
Yes.
the difference is that when I went to film school, we didn't have digital. So we
Hmm.
didn't have phones to make
Yeah,
them
yeah,
on.
yeah.
Yeah.
um, we had 16 millimeter, which cost a lot of money to purchase the thing and then process it. Anyways, I've made the small films with no money and my friends and cold pizza, and I've done that. So I understand that process.
Hmm.
I've cooked, I've been the craft person, the wardrobe person, the driver, I've done all of those positions on my films as well. And I think for me, what I've learned to appreciate is how amazing it is as a director when you have really capable people who can do those things for you,
Ah.
how much more it opens
Yes.
up your ability. I mean, it was learning. It wasn't just like automatically, I was like, yay, I can do it, because I'm used to
Uh-huh.
thinking of all
Yes.
of these different things. And so it took a while for my producing partner to be like, it doesn't look like you're working on your shot board. It looks like you're working on my work. So go away and work on your work. And I had to actually sort of train myself to be like, oh yeah, I actually do have work. I do need to read the script again and figure out what I want to do, and be more, maybe have more time with my DP to talk about not logistics and how much the light's going to cost, but knowing somebody else is worrying about how much it's going to cost, and we just get to talk about what we want it to look like and watch a bunch of films. And he then can decide this is the package that we need, and then someone's going to be like, great, we can afford it, probably. And it's just like, oh wow, I've never had that
Yes.
before, because
Yeah.
it's literally been like, all right, let me get my pantyhose and put it on the lens, and all of those kinds of things. So I appreciate how, because of course for every indie filmmaker, the fantasy is about, oh man, when I have money, it's going to be so great. I'm going to be able to pay
Exactly.
myself.
True.
Exactly.
And you kind of just think about
Yeah.
paying yourself,
Yeah.
which is wonderful and it's important.
Yes.
So I'm not discrediting that, but it's more than that. It's more than just paying yourself. It's also the importance of looking after yourself, the things that we get away with because your shoot is one day, it's experimental, and you have a lot of adrenaline and your friends love you. Hopefully they
Yes.
still love you at the end.
Yeah.
But what like the different, when with this film, for example, I'll give you a story with this film, Farewell Amor. I mean, we had a bigger budget, but we didn't have a big budget. And so there were everything that we could cut, we did, which included transportation for me. So I was taking public transportation to the set with my crew. And I've always done that. So it was just like, oh, this, I mean, what's the big deal?
Yeah.
But it's different if you're doing that for 2 or 3 days or even 1 week. It's a very different situation when if you're doing that for 5 weeks in the summer. And, you know, there's all of this requirements, and my investors are sitting at the monitor with me and asking questions, and people are watching the dailies every day and, you know, sending in their notes, and, you know, like the kind of pressure, like I really need to be focused, which means I need to be well rested. I need to, you know, and do all of these things. So the last thing I needed was in the morning at the bus stop trying to figure out, wait, which bus am I supposed to take? Which way is uptown? Which way is downtown?
Yes.
And it was so stressful, that one thing, to not have somebody to be responsible for just making sure that I make it to set and I sit in the chair and somebody hands me whatever I need to eat or drink. And then my only job is just to think about what I need to accomplish visually for that film. And so that was a lesson that I took away, was that I will never again work on anything where I don't have transportation, because it was so stressful. And it was just, it was brain power that I couldn't afford to use on the subway. I needed to actually think about my work. So,
Yes.
and now I know. And now I know.
Yeah.
You know.
Nice.
Sure. So, as you're both the writer and director of the film, while writing the screenplay, did you already have an idea of the cast, or did you find the cast after you had completed the screenplay?
In this case, well, in most cases, I find the cast after the screenplay. However, oftentimes I will have an idea of the kind of person that I'm writing about, or, I mean, a lot of my scripts are about people in my family, or, you know, personal people that I've met, people that I know, who are not necessarily actors. So I'm not going to cast them, but I might have a face in my mind. I might, you know, substitute my uncle with, you know, fill in the blank act, Denzel Washington. And, you know, obviously as an independent filmmaker, I'm not expecting to cast Denzel, but when I'm writing it, it's useful to think about, how would Denzel do this? How would he think about what would he say? What would be the rhythm of his speech? What, blah, 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 blah. And I can write it that way. And then when I actually cast the role, then I work with the actor to make it something that they would do and that fits with their body and this fits in their mouth, and not just the imaginary mouth that I had. But it can also be useful to talk to the person, to the actor, if they're open. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it isn't, but to just be like, you know, this is the person who I had in mind, you know, showing, in this case, because Farewell Amor was inspired by an aunt and an uncle, you know, I showed them pictures of my aunt and uncle's wedding, where I told them stories about their relationship and, you know, what happened, and a whole bunch of background that I had used when I was writing that was useful to me as I was crafting the story. I had musical playlists for each character that was useful for me to write their characters. And so I kept those playlists. And when I started, after I casted the actors, I shared those playlists with them as like, this is music that I think Walter would listen to, or Esther would listen to, or, you know, and that just ended up being research for them.
Nice.
Yes. And on the music, I think this is a great time to ask this question. First of all, I just want to just say that from the soundtrack of your film, I've received many great songs for my own personal playlist, right? So my question being is, how did you pick the music, and what was the process of picking the music like? And also, what do you want to convey, and what does music and dance mean in Farewell Amor?
The music and dance is actually very important for Farewell Amor. I mean, I have a background in music and in dance and in sound. And so those elements for me as a creator are very important. It's kind of how I think and how I shape a lot of ideas.
Yeah.
But specifically for this story, as I mentioned, it was inspired by a relationship of an aunt and uncle. which I fictionalized. And at the time that I was working on the story or thinking about the story, I was doing a lot of dance, and specifically a style of dance from Angola called Kizomba, which is the style that Walter dances to, and Kuduro, which is the style that Sylvia dances to. So Kizomba and Semba, which is a very beautiful romantic couples dance from Angola. And unlike other couples dances like salsa or bachata or whatever it is, it's unique in the sense that it does not have a regular foot pattern to follow. So salsa is, no matter which way you're turning, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, it's the same foot pattern.
Yes.
And you just go in different directions. With Kizomba, the person who's leading the dance is just reacting to the song and how they feel about the song. And then the person following the leader is reacting to the leader. And so they have to have a particular kind of connection in order to be able to dance together, because otherwise, because you don't know what to expect, you can't anticipate what they're going to do. So you have to kind of really be present with each other.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was a really interesting metaphor for a couple that had been in sync, literally, and then fell out of sync because of distance and time, and are now trying to find their steps together. But meanwhile, he's in sync with somebody else, and that comes so naturally. And we see that how that changes his personality, and he just becomes a different person because it's so natural with that person. That's probably why he fell in love with her in the first place. But he's trying to find that with this old love. And then for Sylvia's music and dance, which is very sort of hip hop inspired or sounding, but Kuduro is a very important form of music in Angola that is, obviously mostly young people listen to and make. But unlike, it's not just fluff music. Like, they talk about really important social issues, about domestic violence, about, lack of jobs, all these different things. And they have all these dance moves to go with it, because it's the one place where young people are able to have a voice in a, in a society that doesn't always listen to young people. And so I thought that would be an interesting metaphor for this young African girl who doesn't feel like she has a voice in this family, and she's struggling to express herself, and she's able to do it through this music and this dance. And so therefore we were very particular about the songs that we chose, down to like getting people to translate all of the lyrics, for every song, to make sure that it actually spoke to them. I mean, the majority of people who watch the film will not know exactly what they're saying, but you can sort of feel the vibe. And if you do happen to understand Portuguese and know what they're saying, then I want it to mean something, and not just be a song about soap and washing dishes or something like that. So it was very important how we were able to sort of craft it together, and then have the composition to complement that in different places, and to use that music and culture as a way to, as sort of like another layer to the story and how the story was being told.
Yes, and it is reflecting, and it is another layer for me, at least. That is another layer on top of the story, and which is great.
Thank you.
It's very great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, talking about dancing, you see, dancing is an important element in the lives of all the three characters. So, for the characters, what is the meaning of dancing for each individual characters in their perception?
In their perception, I think, for Walter, and this is something that I noticed when I was going to a lot of Kizomba dance clubs, is that most of the people who go to those clubs are just working class people. They're nurses, they're bus drivers, they're cab drivers, they're, teachers. They just kind of do things where they're not necessarily hugely visible in their everyday life or important, in their everyday life, quote unquote. But this is the one place where they get to become important. They get to dress up and put on some beautiful perfume or cologne and just kind of morph into almost like a different person, or their real person, they get to be themselves. I mean, I think at the end of the day, for each of them, they get to be themselves, but it's sort of expressed in a different way. For Walter, he gets to be himself amongst people who don't look at him as just a lowly cab driver, but he's a seducer and a lover and a mover and all these different things. For Esther, she's able to be herself. That's where she's able to be vulnerable. That's where she's able to show her fears. That's where she's able to really speak to, I'm not sure that this is working. I'm not sure this is a good idea. I'm really confused. I'm really scared, all of those things, where in real life, she's sort of putting on this face of like, yes, Jesus will help. Everything will be wonderful. Don't worry about it,
Yeah.
And similarly for Sylvia, I think that's the one place where she too can show how angry or frustrated she is. She's, she doesn't know these people really, and she's kind of stuck in the middle, and she doesn't have a choice. And she wants to be in America, but she doesn't really want to be. And she wants to meet her dad, but she's not really sure she wants to meet her dad. And, all of the different emotions in between. And she's able to express that through her dance.
And, talking about family, while I was watching Farewell Amor, for some weird reason, I kept going back to, have you seen this show called The Sopranos?
Yes, I love The Sopranos.
Yeah. So, the show creators and showrunners have defined nuances and psychology of a family on screen under highlighting another genre of crime and the whole Italian mafia thing, right? While I was watching Farewell Amor, I kept thinking, is there any attempt that with your film you try to define a family and their universal and common traits throughout the whole globe and highlighting it under a basic immigrant story?
Ask the question again. Is there a way that I tried to highlight a family that did?
Is there any attempt that you try to define, universal traits of a family? This is how a family would be on any planet, just under the banners of it being an immigrant story.
That's a great question. I certainly didn't set out, I didn't sit down at my desk and be like, today I'm going to write a script about a family and try and define them. I didn't do that.
Okay.
Yeah. However, what I ended up doing, and subconsciously perhaps, is challenge the idea of what is a family. Like, are you a family only if you live together and spend X percentage of the year living under the same roof or living in the same country or city, and my story happens to be about immigrants, but there's people who are separated for all sorts of reasons, for military service, for incarceration, they're in jail, for, I just work a lot and I travel for work. So dad is back and forth, or mom is back and forth, or the kids are in boarding school, or whatever the case is. Does that make you any less of a family in that way? If you're not sharing your everyday, because in this case, and certainly in the case of my aunt and uncle, they weren't together physically for many, many years, but they call each other every day. They talk, they Skype, they, exchange letters, they do all these different things. So does that count? Does it not? Does, and what does it look like? And I think, especially having grown up consuming, majority American media, which has a very specific definition of a family. It's 3.5 kids, a dog, a house. Everyone has their own room. There's a living room. This is how you're supposed to sit. There's a TV. You're supposed to watch a football game on a Sunday. You're supposed to do this. You're supposed to do that. Barbecue on the weekends and
breakfast.
And it's like, who does that actually apply to? Because I don't know that most people live that kind of a life. So does that mean that we're not really a family, or, So I guess it was sort of challenging that idea. In the time that I wrote it, I was under the impression that I was just talking about my one little corner and the little 2 people that I knew. And it turns out that it was it resonated with so many people from across the world that I met like you who watched the film and were like, oh my God, I can relate to that story. I know that story.
True.
My friend, my cousin, myself, my this, my,
Yes.
in all sorts of different ways and iterations. And that was really surprising to me, the idea of, oh, this is actually more normal than the picket fence and the dog scenario.
Yes.
Yeah. So like
exactly.
while writing the film, it became a conscious choice to question what's a definition of a family, right?
Possibly. I mean, I was really just focusing on the characters and they're trying to answer for themselves what is a family, right?
Okay.
Because that's been the goal all this time, is like, we're going to be together, we're going to live as a family. That's what Esther says at the very beginning when they come in and he's like, oh, maybe you'll go to college, and she's like, no, we have to live as a family as God intended it.
Yes.
And it's not that easy. Living under the same house, under the same roof, doesn't necessarily mean you're closer. They probably were farther away from each other than they had been when they lived on different continents, right? Because all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, I don't know who you are. I actually have no idea who this person is, because the person that I knew was in a different context, and that context no longer works here. And the way that we, our rhythm doesn't work the same in this context. And so they have to redefine for themselves, but they're still reaching for this idea of like, but we're supposed to be like this, but I can't have a girlfriend and a wife at the same time. I have to get rid of her. I can't, I can't have Jesus, or I can have Jesus and my husband at the same time. And turns out it's a little messy. And, so they're having to figure out whether the idea of family that they've been reaching for and working towards all this time actually works in practical terms.
Nice.
So like there what I've got from your answer and from the movie, I was just saying that the movie like shows me the difference between lonely and alone, and under the context of that family. And it, like greatly present for me in the movie. It resonates very well, and I could resonate that with the answer as well. So yes.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad that you felt that.
So are you a reader? Are you a reader?
Am I a reader?
Yeah.
Yes and no. I am a slow reader because of the way that I ingest information. I have to visualize it in order to get it.
Yes.
And so when I read, I have to kind of pause and see it. And then I'm like, okay, I get it, which makes reading tedious and slow. So I listen to a lot of audiobooks. And oftentimes I have to read a lot of stuff for work. My agents are constantly throwing things at me. So I have been reading more than I have in the past, but mostly via listening to audiobooks and podcasts.
So any 3 books you would recommend?
That I would recommend?
Yes.
Ooh. Well, let me see. Okay, there's a book that I'm actually working on that I actually really enjoyed. The book is called Behold the Dreamers. It's a book by Mbolombwe, and it is similar to Farewell in the sense that it is a story of an African family that comes to New York. And it's written and it takes place during the housing crash of 2007, 2008. And so kind of looks at what that experience was like for an immigrant family. That it happens to be working for a white Wall Street family at that time, and sort of the juxtaposition between those two. Let's see, what else did I read for the second time Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, that I actually really, really enjoyed. I don't know, it just kind of gave me a different perspective on her and and American life at that time. And then another book that I really enjoyed, although it's not a fun read per se, but it was it was fun in some ways. Like there was a lot that was enjoyable about it, but it was also, very serious and heavy. Is a book by Tarana Burke. Tarana Burke is the woman who started the Me Too movement. And it's essentially her autobiography, I should say. And but then there's a fourth one. Okay, her book is called Unbound.
Yes.
Unbound. And then, I read The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I love Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's one of my favorite. And it's kind of dense at first. I actually tried to physically read the book and it was taking me a while, but I loved listening to it. And it's he's a great writer. So those are my 4.
Yeah.
Nice. It's
Nice.
always so great to hear from the guest. Like whenever we ask this question abruptly, ki, are you a reader? Recommend us 3 books. Every guest is like at first fumbling, ki, oh, what should I say? What should I say? There are too many books. But then they say these 3 books which come to their mind immediately, because
Yeah.
it kind of becomes important at that moment, I guess. And
Yes.
in that context, I want to ask you, ki, and like there are some films that I watched early on in my life that has deeply influenced me. So right now, as I said, when I check my footage, it might sound very superficial, but I might find some traces of those filmmakers in that footage. So does that happen to you, or do you find ki this filmmaker, like because I watched this film, it has kind of influenced my writing style or my movie making style?
I'm sure it does. But I'm terrible with names. And so oftentimes I'll watch things and I'll completely forget the name of the film or the name of the filmmaker, especially stuff that I watched when I was in school. But the visual will stay with me, right? Because that's how my brain works. And so later somebody else will be like, that shot was just like blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, great. I was not aware. I probably stored that information somewhere. But there's been a few times that I've watched something and been like, that would be a really nice, I'd love to be able to recreate that, or I'd love to be able to figure out how to do that. But I find that, as I mentioned earlier, I come from a sound background. I actually went to school with the intent of being a sound designer and a sound person, because I just did a lot of music and sound growing up. Before I wanted to be a director. I did a lot of writing, that was easy, but I really loved sound. And at the time that I went to school, where we were learning on celluloid tape, making films was infinitely more complicated, for one. And the access to post-production houses, like being able to get into the business of film. So, I wanted to be a sound designer. I wanted to be a Foley artist in particular. And I visited a Foley studio with my class and I just loved it. And I was like, oh my God, how do I work here? Like, tell me, how do I make this my career? And they were like, that's so great. So you would mop the floors for about 10 years. And then maybe at that point, we'll let you, mop the sound booth or something. And it was just like, wait, what? Like, I don't know if I'm getting paid for those 10 years either. And there was only 2 sound post-production sound houses in New York. And all post-production happens in New York. So it's kind of like 2 post-production sound houses in the world, or at least in my world. And it's maybe 10 years and maybe we'll consider you some. So obviously that didn't seem like a viable option, right? So anyways, all of that to say, I don't think in visuals first. So therefore, when I watch people's films, I tend to get more involved in the characters and the arc of the character and the development and the stakes and how that worked out, the writing. and how the story is told in that way, and how the story unfolds, let me say, and try and retain that. And then when it comes to the visuals, I really depend so much on my director of photography and just collaborate with them. And I'll say certain things about what it feels like, or what I'd like. Maybe there's colors, or there's some sort of music or movement that feels natural in that space, and we'll create that together. But my way of coming in is really more through sound and script than it is through the visual aspect of things. It doesn't mean I don't appreciate other people's work, but that's just not how I think.
Yeah. And now I want to ask you, a very open-ended question, which is half glass full or half glass empty?
I think half glass full.
Yeah. So
I like to think half glass full.
yeah. Yeah. So half glass full, right?
Yes, I'll go with that.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
You talked about how it was very hard making films back in the day. Even in India, we hear people from in the industry ki, back in the day it was so hard, and now it's so accessible to anyone. Everyone's making film these days, and it's true. Anyone can make a film these days with a with a good phone, and everyone can manage sound and all that. So, do you think, like, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a great thing that there's more access, especially for more people. I mean, for the longest time, cinema as we know it has been completely dominated by one group, and one perspective. There's been one point of view. There's been, when people talk about the greats of cinema, they're usually referring to this one little group of people and 5 names at best, or, something like that. Yeah. And so to be able to diversify that pool in any way, more women, more people of color, more people with disabilities, just more people with a different way of looking at the world, I think is always wonderful. And we can only benefit from that. I mean, just think about how much you learn about the world, about anybody or anything from just seeing anything. How much better off would we be if we just were able to look at things from a different perspective in a lot of situations. I think what's a challenge about it is, and maybe it's a challenge. Well, let me put it like this. I think it's a challenge. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but I think it is a challenge. The expectation of immediacy that comes with the increased accessibility. And what I mean is, when I went to film school and, it was this expensive to get this, and then you had to do this, and then you had to do this, and you had to and mop the floor for 10 years and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
All of us knew, all right, this is going to be hard. And if you want to do this, then sell a kidney. I'm going to be living with my mother. I'm going to, you just kind of come in with different expectations of what it's going to take to really perfect your craft, so that, and then it's like you have to be very strategic about, like, okay, I'm going to learn this one tool. I'm going to make this relationship so that I can get to here, and then from there I can move to this place, and and all of this time you're working on your craft, you're writing scripts, you're doing all of that work, so you're practicing and you're getting better, which is only always a good thing. Filmmaking is apprenticeship work. It's not like you go to school, you study for 4 years, you get a certificate of filmmaking, and now hire me, I'm a filmmaker. It's, even if you graduate from the top school, as I did, you still need to practice, because people are like, okay, that's nice that you graduated, but what have you made? And who do you know? And who have you worked with? And do they like working with you? And have they ever seen your work? And where has your work shown? and blah, 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 you know, so it's really, it's about the relationships and it's about the quality of your work, and you have to keep practicing. And I think when you're able to boom, bam, 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 and in 5 minutes you have a completed film, it feels like you don't have to practice that much, because you're like, first of all, it's on Instagram and I have 100 likes. So what are you telling me?
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily make you better. You know, it doesn't challenge you in the same way to like really keep honing your craft, because you can kind of slap on a filter and da 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 da, and then you're done, and or it feels a lot easier. And so what that does, it's not to say that everything needs to be hard. That's not the point. What it does is that when things do get hard, which they always will, what I find with a lot of younger filmmakers is that they get discouraged a lot more easily, because it's like, oh, I failed. I only got 50 likes this time. And so therefore I you know, forget it. I'm going home. I should never do this again. Yeah. And it's like, no, it just means that your ideas weren't clear and you just need to keep working at it. You need to do better. Or it's, you know, I didn't become a millionaire overnight. I didn't break the box office. I didn't break the internet. So therefore it means that it's not worth anything. And it's like, well, the point isn't to break the internet. I mean, that's a nice side benefit, but the point is like to get better at the thing that you do, to get better at telling a story or delivering a message. And you can only do that by practicing. And so that's the only downfall that I see with having much more accessibility and so fast. It feels like, oh, I can skip all these steps and just be a celebrity at the end of the day. And there's so much focus on being a celebrity and less on telling a good story. That's all.
And you know, talking about that, do you like, because now you have had your directorial debut, you have made these shots and all this, do you ever feel ki now this process has become tiring, or I don't get the kick that I used to get when I was young or something? Or is it always interesting?
There's always something that can be interesting. I mean, there's things that are, I don't love budgets. That's never been something that I'm like, I can't wait to figure out how to spend this money.
Yeah.
Or, you know, the distribution, like there's things that I don't love. But, you know, you get to work with different people. You get to learn different skills all the time. You get to see other people doing amazing things that it's like, I don't know how to do that. I worked on a show recently, and, you know, the script was it was this one scene, and it was kind of a fantasy, and the description was just really vague, you know, like there's something to do with water and reflection, something. And my DP found some picture that was just a really beautiful picture, and it'd be like, wow, it'd be great if we could, I want to recreate that, and I have no idea how to do that. And so we had this, you know, the crew meeting, and I was like, I want this. I want this picture. I want my actors looking like this, and then I'll tell them what to do when we get there. And they were like, great. And so the special effects guy and this guy and the stunt guy and all of these teams came together and just built this thing that was literally a picture on our cell phone. And next thing you know, we have the scene, and it was amazing to watch that, you know. And who does that? Like, who goes to their job every day, you know, at blah, blah, blah company, and is able to just make stuff out of nowhere or create, you know, outside was 2022 last week, and now it's 1800 something or other, because the production department came in and changed everything. And, you know, I mean, it's, we work in such we work with magic. So it's impossible not to be excited about that, and sometimes scared and intimidated, but it's exciting what we do.
Like, there are always things that you can find beauty in, right, while making films. It's
Right.
magical. It's wonderful. Yeah.
I read this book the other day, speaking of books, that I was considering adapting to a film, and it takes place in Paris. And I've never been to Paris, and I know nothing about this world, but it was fascinating. And it was like, I could live in Paris for 3 months, to
Yeah.
adapt this.
Yes.
Right. I
It's
love
beautiful.
that.
The job of making films is beautiful. Like
It
I
is.
I,
It
I
is.
cannot agree more.
Hmm.
But and
Yeah.
this, this has been a wonderful session. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Ekwa, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was such a beautiful thing for you to come here
Yeah.
and talk with us.
Thank
Yeah.
you for
Yeah.
inviting me. I really
Yeah.
appreciate the invite, and it's been a pleasure for me as well. So I thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Ekwa. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this was
Thank you.
Pop
Thank
Media
you.
Podcast. Thank you.